In this video, we're going to modernize the last generation Cadillac Eldorado, and I'm really excited for this redesign because I think it's one of the most underrated designs, and it also is pretty much a really good modernization of the Eldorados from the 70s and 80s, which I'm going to show you when we go through the generations starting from the 50s. But before we do that, let me show you quickly in a sketch here what I want to do with this is going to be the last generation, so from 2000 to 2002, that's the generation we're going to work on. I love the design of this thing. It looks very solid. It doesn't look like the three boxes, the hood, the greenhouse, and the trunk are separated from each other. It's a very solid, heavy looking machine, and it looks nice proportionally as well, with the greenhouse almost centered in this design with the big V8 up front. So I think modernizing this with this design, keeping similar proportions, is gonna be very cool to see, because I really think this could be a modern looking Cadillac if we just worked more with the graphics and maybe lower the roof line a little bit. So I want to add some parts from the ATS-V. I like that design a lot, and I think the parts, for example, the front bumper is going to suit this design right here. I'm going to take headlights from a Nissan Frontier and apply it onto this design. I think they are going to suit this design really well, and work a little bit on the graphics, and of course the wheels, and bring the entire car a little closer to the ground, because that's what modern cars look like. So let's have a look at the generation, starting up top with the 1953 Cadillac Eldorado up here. And the thing with the Eldorado, when you look at it like this, from decade to decade almost, it's almost like a living organism. You see the fins growing, and then they kind of go a little bit back and further into the body until they completely disappear in the 70s. But let's have a look at this gorgeous machine, the 1953 Eldorado. Typical 50s design. What was typical for this design is you have this dip in the bodywork right here, and this became almost a standard in other manufacturer designs of this time. It was something that was first implemented in the Eldorado and then became almost the norm of cars of this era. Usually I'm not a big fan of chrome, but for 50s cars like this, you can't not have chrome on these cars. I can't believe these beautiful machines were actually made in the 50s with the attention to detail, and I think this attention to detail is something that's been lost in modern cars. They feel more mass-produced and not so much passion in the details like we had in the old 50s here. And we do have the beginning of a fin here in the rear end, as you can see. It's very tiny, but then if we go into the 1959, you can see that it grew by a lot. And this is the fin, or the rocket shapes that you have in the rear end. I really like this design. It's very cool, very unique. Big, massive fins in the rear, which is typical for the late 50s cars, and it suits this car so well. We still have a lot of chrome in the front end, but you can see that the hood now got a lot flatter and looking more modern. We also have this line that beautifully goes into the front fender and then kind of fades away into the bodywork here. Beautiful design, and same thing here. Very strong attention to detail. Now I want to keep focus on the fins in the rear. From 59 to 60, now we're moving away from this fin era, and it's becoming more integrated and less emphasized in the coming generations, and that goes for the 60 as well. You can compare this massive fin in 59 to the 60 fin. It's a lot more streamlined here, and I personally prefer this design over this. This looks almost like a cartoon car. It's still a very cool design, but from an aesthetic point, from a styling standpoint, I definitely prefer the 60s fin right here. Moving further down to 1962, and keep your focus on the fin. Here it goes up a little bit in the 60, and then we have the 1962 down here with these gorgeous long lines, making this look massive, which it also was, but we have a lot of unbroken lines in the body, really emphasizing the length even more. And now the wing is even more integrated than it was in the previous generation, and it's becoming less and less noticeable. So moving into 71, you can see that the wing is not completely gone, or the fin I should say, but now we have a different design approach to the side. We have this shoulder or this muscle over the rear wheel arches. We still have the rear wheel being covered, which was typical for this era of car design, but the fuselage design that's rounded in the side that we had in the previous generations are becoming more and more flat in the side and more like we're used to seeing cars today. So moving into 1979, you can see that a lot changed here in this design. This is where the end of the muscle car has been gone for a couple of years in 79, and the fuel crisis and all of that of the 70s. It still had a massive V8 up front, but it only had around 125 horsepower compared to 340 in previous generations, and it got a lot more cleaned up and very solid, very straight and horizontal in the bodywork. And this goes for this detail as well. You can see how the trunk cuts into this big pillar. And this is what I mean with the last generation being a great modernization of this design, because this area is very much inspired in the latest generation from this 79 model. Moving further down to 84, we do have some smoother integration of this area. I prefer the 79 design over the 84 design down here. This looks a little bland to me. It doesn't have the same kind of personality as this rear end that we have in the 79 model, but it's still a pretty cool looking design. Moving down to 2000 and the final generation. So what I want to show you here, if we go into this slide right here, I sound very old when I say slide, but you know what I mean. I want to compare I think this was the 79, right, to the last generation of the Eldorado, and just have a look at the modernization of this design. We have a very horizontal vertical front end. We do have that in the 2000 model as well, and I want to show you this rear end piece. So this boot or trunk has these LEDs in the kind of the edge of the car, and then we have this line going into this pillar, very similar to what we have in the 2000 last generation. So this is what I mean with this being a great modernization of the 79 model, and I think we can take this design and modernize it even further. So I want to take some inspiration from the ATS-V up here. As you can see, beautiful Cadillac, still has the sharp angles that it's had for a very long time in Cadillac's design identity, and that's something I want to keep. However, I do want to keep the proportions of the 2000s Eldorado and work more with the graphics, so there's no mistaking when you see this redesign that it actually is based on a 2000 Eldorado. So with that said, let's continue in Photoshop here and let's see how this Eldorado is going to turn out. I think it's a shame that Cadillac decided to ditch the Eldorado. I think it's a very cool car, but as you know, these days people don't really buy sedans anymore, and they definitely don't buy coupes in massive volumes, and that's the reason why they had to ditch the Eldorado back in the early 2000s. But if we were to bring it back today, what I want to do, as I said, I want to work with the graphic design of this car. I want to add some Nissan Frontier headlights, which is probably going to be the final thing I'm going to do to this redesign. And I also want to have the front lower air intake from the ATS-V, but I want to redesign the side intakes a little more to be more in line with the top half of the front end, so we have more of a horizontal line in the lower part going from the side air intakes into the middle air intake, and that would also almost be mirrored in the top half with the headlights and the horizontal grille as well, having those be in the same horizontal line, also emphasizing the width of the front end more that way. Now, I wasn't sure if I wanted to lower the greenhouse and play around with those proportions, but I decided to do that anyway. It does make it look maybe a little cartoonish when you do that, but that's also because I want this to be a sketch and not just I want it to look more like a concept car than a production car, if that makes sense. So I want to have big modern wheels from the ATS-V. I want to have the front end look like a modernization of the Eldorado. I also decided to pop in the hood from the ATS-V here because I think it suits the overall design. It's still very boxy, and the design philosophy of Cadillac hasn't really changed in 23 years. So we can still have elements from the 2000 Eldorado work really well with a semi-modern ATS-V. And that's what I'm doing right here. I'm also taking the mirrors from the ATS-V and I'm dechroming the trim piece, the trim piece that goes around the greenhouse. I want to have that be black, but I'm not touching the greenhouse design, because that to me is what makes an Eldorado, specifically with the big volume that you have in the rear. So I think this is a really interesting approach to creating muscle over the rear end without having this typical shoulder line that kind of curves right above the rear axle. Instead, the designers here decided to build mass above the rear fender instead of creating a curvature, and I think it looks really cool. It looks planted and it looks like it has the power going to the back, and that's what you want when you have a rear-wheel drive car, in addition to this cut that goes in from the trunk and then cuts into the C-pillar in this case and creates this typical Eldorado line going back to 79, as I showed you, probably even earlier than that. I'm still not 100% sure if I made the right decision to lower the greenhouse. It makes it look almost like a supercar now, and that was not my intention. But anyway, it still looks pretty cool like this with the lowered roof line. And I also decided to add a more of a sharp shoulder line to the design, going from the corner of the front headlight into the tail, and kind of fades before it meets the taillight, because it really doesn't have a connection point to a vertical taillight. So I want to just fade it out before it connects to the taillight in the rear end. In the lower part, bringing it down closer to the ground, adding some modern curvatures and surface treatments to, for example, underneath the door. Want to have some modern styling there, and also in the rear, and of course in the front, with a small little black lip that you have at the very lowest part of the front end, creating a good foundation for the rest of the graphics to be built upon. That's my redesign of the Cadillac Eldorado. Super fun to do. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.